Okay, so once there's been sensory detection of different categories of tastement, these chemicals that have been dissolved from food and have worked their way down into the moats around the papilla, the nipples of the tongue, where the taste pores allow for access to the cilia, right, that stick off of the taste receptor cells, which are kind of crescent shaped and arranged like sections of an orange within the taste buds. Well, they will, bind and respond, release neurotransmitter onto what are called cranial nerves. And these cranial nerves are a certain kind of neuron called a pseudo unipolar neuron. And they're very, again, like all of these cells that we're seeing associated with, afferent input, they have evolved specializations that make them look structurally very different so they can carry out their specific functional roles, right? And these pseudo-unipolar neurons, if you look at them, they're sort of illustrated on this slide here. They have like a little circle that you see there. That's the cell body or the soma of these cells. And then they have a single pole, a single membrane-bound sort of projection off of it. That's the pseudo-unipole, right? Because what happens right after that is that it bifurcates, it splits. There's a projection that, goes to the tongue and will be receiving, it'll be the receptive, membrane for the taste receptor cell, release of neurotransmitter after it binds a tastant. And then, so that's effectively, functionally, that is a dendrite, basically, of this pseudo-unipolar cell. And it's carrying the information in. It can, initiate an action potential, say, and then carry it in, towards the cell body, towards that pole off of the cell body. So that's effectively a sort of dendritic projection. And then it shoots past, right, the little unipole that goes to the cell body and works its way into the central nervous system. And that's effectively, functionally, the axonal component of this, pseudo-unipolar cell, which really kind of has like two poles. It is one pole coming off the cell body. That's why they call it unipolar, but it's sort of pseudo-unipolar because it has a dendritic projection from the taste receptor cell, working its way in, and then an axonal, functionally axonal projection working its way, further in, this time into the brain stem. And what you can see illustrated here is that the cell bodies, the soma of these pseudo-unipolar cells that are going to be carrying information from, taste receptor cells in the mouth, right, are going to be organized, clumped together in what we call ganglia. And these are collections of neuron cell bodies, in this case, these pseudo-unipolar, cell bodies that are kind of on the way. It's like it's bulged there because it's got all the cell bodies that are localized at that spot. Now, you can see that the information that's being carried from the tongue is actually carried in, the taste information is going to be carried in via very distinct sort of zones, which are served by distinct what we call cranial nerves. The tongue is sort of segmented into specific regions that are served by, specific what are called cranial nerves. And there are 12 cranial nerves, and there's one on the left and one on the right for each one of them. And the cranial nerves that are going to be carrying in taste information from the tongue include the facial nerve. This is a very important nerve because it also is what they call an efferent or a motor nerve that controls all the different muscles that allow you to generate various facial expressions, right? But it also has an afferent component, and this afferent component is taste receptor input. Like, remember, the taste receptors themselves are separate crescent-shaped cells, in the taste buds. They're short, they're little crescent-shaped again, they're arranged like an orange in the taste bud, but they're going to release neurotransmitter then onto effectively what is functionally the dendrite of the facial nerve, the dendritic component of those nerves, of those pseudo-unipolar nerves, and the facial nerves carrying the taste information from the taste buds that are localized on the anterior, the front 2/3 of the tongue. Now, the next part, basically the tongue, the posterior, the back 1/3 of the tongue, Well, there's a nerve that sounds like it's carrying information from further back in your throat, right? It's called the glossopharyngeal nerve. This is cranial nerve number 9. The facial nerve is cranial nerve number 7. The glossopharyngeal nerve is going to be carrying information back, from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, while the vagus nerve, you'd think you'd be done with your tongue, right? But actually, it turns out that, remember, there are taste buds that are localized on the soft palate at the roof of the mouth. There are taste buds that are found on the epiglottis, that flap that covers over the trachea, when you're swallowing food. So the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10, is going to be carrying that additional, input from taste receptor cells that are arrayed around the mouth. Now, it's important to note that your tongue is put back together. Your mouth and tongue are put back together. They're coming in through these separate zonal cranial nerve inputs, right? Again, facial anterior 2/3 of the tongue, glossopharyngeal posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and then the rest of the mouth, including the epiglottis and the soft palate, coming in through the vagus nerve. But all of these cables are, the cell, they're going to pass through, there's the ganglia, right, where the cell bodies are located for these pseudo unipolar cells, and then they're going to work their way in their cables, their axonal cables, into the brainstem. And I apologize for this image because it's actually showing the brainstem sort of upside down, right? It's as if they're hanging somebody from, their neck. So it looks kind of like this, actually. But really, what we're looking at, here's the brainstem. This is the frontal lobe right here. Here's the temporal lobes right here. Well, the inputs are going to come in, from the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and portions of the vagus, and they're going to converge on a nucleus. That's a collection of gray matter, of neuron cell bodies, the dendrites that come off those cell bodies, and the incoming synaptic connections, the axon terminals. In this case, many that are arriving from, the 3 cranial nerves that are carrying taste input from the mouth. And it's called the solitary nucleus. And the solitary nucleus is also known as the nucleus of the solitary tract, or the NTS, or the nucleus tractus solitarius. They have lots of different, terminology to refer to this, but you can remember it as the solitary nucleus. The solitary nucleus puts your tongue back together in terms of taste input. It also merges that incoming taste input from the tongue with ascending visceral afferents, like sensory neurons that are arrayed in the gut, in the stomach, in the small intestine, in the large intestine, in the body cavity, because it matters, what this part of your body is telling your brain about, how full you are, how, if you're nauseous or, if you're hungry, all these things. That should be integrated. It's going to be integrated in the solitary nucleus, in the brainstem, with all this taste information from the tongue. And if you are really, really hungry and somebody offers you a chocolate chip cookie, right? And you're like, oh, this is delicious, and it tastes like extraordinary, it tastes amazing if you're super hungry. But then you have 10 cookies, and then the next cookie that you try, that visceral input and the convergence and the integration of visceral inputs with, taste inputs from the tongue will send ascending projections that will make your experience, your perception of the cookie, very different. After you've had